Thank you very much, Bianca, for that introduction. And good afternoon, everybody. Though from what I'm wearing, you can probably tell I'm not sitting in the Philippines at the moment, but in a rather chilly English country morning with the clouds and the cold. So it's very early in the morning for me. But I'm very glad to be here. I'm very glad to have been asked by my colleagues in the history department at Ateneo to give one of these lectures. And as you can see from the title on the slide, I'm trying to fit in with the theme for this series as closely as I possibly can. And I want to talk about how people reclaim the past and disrupt the present around Mount Mayon. I've changed the title slightly from telling histories to telling stories, but we can have a conversation of the difference between histories and stories about the eruption of Mount Mayon in the Philippines. But before I begin with the lecture proper, I'd like to say a few words about my approach to doing history, and in particular what I call applied history. The eminent English landscape historian William George Hoskins wrote over 60 years ago that, and I'm quoting here, "To write history requires a combination of documentary research and fieldwork," end quote. I think most of us are much more familiar with the documentary side of things and perhaps not quite so comfortable with the fieldwork. For this fieldwork, the historian requires a more expanded toolkit than the historian normally has, and he or she needs to borrow many tools and methodologies from other disciplines. Of course, there are oral history interviews with which historians are already familiar, though I find quite surprising really how underutilized as a methodology in Philippine historiography oral history is, given the very rich historical nature of the living past. And I can just think terms of the first quarter storm, martial law, Pinatubo, etc., immediately spring to mind. But when I'm talking about borrowing, I'm talking about perhaps borrowing from the social sciences, approaches and methodologies such as surveys, focus group discussions, participant observation, from the natural sciences, community mapping, transect sampling, scenario building, and from other disciplines in the humanities, life narratives, and film. I found a particularly effective method when it comes to research on natural hazards and around disaster zones is to think about or to use transect interviews. These are interviews that are conducted in situ in a disaster area, or actually while walking through a disaster area and getting people to comment on what they see and relate their stories immediately to the environment around them. And of course, if it's with a knowledgeable resource person, that makes it even more effective. Turning to the Philippines then, as Filipinos, you all know about disruption in your lives. Bianca already mentioned it in her introduction. Disruptions in your lives long before the COVID pandemic. And perhaps what's unique or different about COVID is more to do with the scale of the disruption or the disaster, it being national rather than local or regional, and perhaps also the length of time, it being measured in months and years rather than days. So again, what springs to mind immediately is thinking about the Pinatubo eruption and the lahars that continued throughout the 1990s. So again, perhaps that's not so different than in the past. We know about disruptions that punctuate daily life in the Philippines, whether they be typhoon, flood, earthquake, volcanic eruption, now as in the past, perhaps even more so today because of the complexity and interrelatedness of modern infrastructure and the economy. And of course, that's debatable, and we could have a discussion about that. That is to say, Filipinos are used to disruptions, and Filipino history can be seen as a series of disruptions, both physical and social. We also know about reclaiming the past. After all, most of us listening to my talk today are historians or have an interest in the past. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. Looking to the past, we perhaps seek answers to contemporary issues and/or find in the past senses of identity and solidarity in concepts such as bayanihan. As students of history too, we're experiencing disruptions from our main sources about the past, the archives that have remained stubbornly shut for most of the last couple of years. So instead, what I thought I'd do in this paper is base it completely on fieldwork around Mount Mayon in January 2018, before the COVID and pandemic, and explore how communities adapt to risk in that setting. And I was lucky or unlucky enough, depending on how you want to see it, to be there doing research anyhow when the volcano erupted before me. And my talk today is about how people perceive volcanic risk, how people interpret, remember, give meaning to volcanic eruptions, and the disruptions it causes or has caused to people's lives. And the point that I want to begin with is to just remind us that not all records are kept in libraries or archives. People tell histories too, about themselves, about the communities they live in, and these sources are still very accessible, even today, through interviews in person or over the internet. As might be expected, around Mayon, the volcano looms large in the minds of people who live around its base, breathe its sulfurous airs, eat of its bounty, and yes, occasionally die from its actions. As humans are storytellers by nature, people tell stories about the volcano in which they attempt to make sense of their own lives and the lives of their communities. These stories are deeply personal, sometimes, capturing local and textured experiences of people and the way they fashion their identities from the culturally available material and the environment around them. But their senses of selfhood are also constructed in such a way that the stories they tell often validate group, corporate, and professional standards and norms. This duality between the personal and the group identity is similarly reflected in the way people talk about themselves or are talked about in relation to significant local landmarks or characteristics of their environment. We can talk about, or people talk about themselves as people of the lake, people of the forest, people of the lowlands, people of the highlands, people of the volcano. Why this is important is that when stories are told and what influences those narratives tell us a lot about how people construct risk and how they perceive their own vulnerabilities. People, in a sense, story the world by constructing meaning out of events and experiences through telling and retelling stories for different purposes in different contexts. What do I mean? Well, the stories people tell are deeply embedded in narrative frameworks and narrative environments that reflect institutional cultures. These master narratives reproduce the values of a dominant social and political group or groups or institutions, even if they are expressed in personal terms and can be termed institutional storytelling. Institutional narratives express deeply held ideological values or positions that reflect group or organizations' claims to expertise about a subject. Corporations are above all storytelling organizations. Professions share specialized vocabularies and common outlooks, and both inadvertently reproduce the moral values about what they perceive as the other. Members of these groups are obliged to conform to institutionally expected narratives in which individual personas are refracted through institutional practices. A better understanding of these master narratives reveals more about how individuals construct themselves as social actors and give meaning to the world around them. All stories are about relationships, principally between individuals and the society they live in, but also about or between people and the surrounding landscape. In much of Bicol, people's stories are intimately bound up with the life history of Mayon, not only when it is convulsed by eruptions, but through the omnipresent sense of risk the volcano imposes on all who live within its reach. But too often, the volcano is professionalized, spoken about in institutional language that is known and understood by only a few. But before we talk about the people, let me introduce the volcano. Mount Mayon is located in Albay, but is the most active volcano in the Philippines. It's a stratovolcano with a perfectly shaped cone, almost an iconic one. It has a basal circumference of 63 kilometers, and at its peak, it rises to about 2,600 meters. It's erupted over 50 times since the first description of eruption in February 1616, but there's no real extant historical account of eruptions that I know of, though there should exist some, prior to the 23rd of October 1766, when, quote, a horrendous explosion devastated the town of Malinao and the surrounding villages, end quote. In fact, our detailed historical record of volcanic activity doesn't really begin till 1800, with most subsequent eruptions being on a small scale, registering 2 or less on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, the VEI index, though the volcano can be or was in continuous eruption, in a continuous eruptive state for decades at a time. I'm thinking here of the 1850s, when almost for the entire decade, in one shape or another, the volcano was in eruption. However, these intermittent low-level volcanic activity has been punctuated on occasion by eruptions of a much higher order, more like VEI 4. The deadliest took place on the 1st of February 1814, when a torrent of fire, lava, and incandescent stones flowed down the volcano, open quote, devastating, burning, and consuming everything, end quote, and reportedly killed 1,200 people, though that is very possibly an exaggeration. Another major eruption occurred on the 23rd of June, 1897, when many settlements at the volcano's base were ruined and approximately 200 to 300 people died. There were no such devastating eruptions during the 20th century, but FEBOC still considered it prudent to evacuate over 73,000 people during the VEI 3 eruption of the 10th of September, 1984. And pyroclastic density current caught farmers unaware during the 3rd of February, 1993 eruption, killing 77 people and causing substantial losses to farmlands, fisheries, and wildlife. So living around the volcano can be a risky business, and it can be a risky business even when there are no eruptions. People are put at risk from the loose-lying debris covering the mountain slopes from past eruptions, especially from rainfall during passing typhoons or tropical storms that can release fast-moving currents of cement-like consistency, known as lahars, that devastate everything in their paths. And there are at least 3 documented accounts when heavy rainfall unleashed lahars, causing a major loss of life. In October 1776, when reportedly thousands of people died, though our source on that one is a little prone to exaggeration. On the 31st of October 1875, when a passing typhoon caused lahars that killed around 1,500 people. First, it was thought that this was an eruption, but it actually subsequently looks like it was lahar. And much more recently, in November 2006, when Typhoon Remming dumped more than 460 millimeters of rain on the volcano, with an official death toll of 754, but with deaths maybe as high as 1,200. The frequency with which events occur ensures that Mayon, therefore, is embedded in local people's consciousness and conversations, and forms an unconscious backdrop or context to their daily narratives. But the way these stories are told depend very much on the institutional frameworks within which the volcano is understood and explained. Just before I start talking about the people, let me just give you a brief note on the methodology that I used. The field work for this research was undertaken, as I said, during the January 2018 eruption, and involved a series of in-depth, unstructured, in situ transect interviews carried out with residents representing very different institutional perspectives. From these, I've selected 5 to illustrate the multiple perspectives about what people think a volcano is and the risks it poses. And these 5 institutional representatives are a volcanologist, an engineer, a politician, a historian, and a local elderly resident. All these informants live within sight of Mayon summit. All speak English, at least to a certain degree, denoting a certain level of educational attainment. All except one is Filipino by birth, and all apart from one is male. And all except one subscribes to a professional affiliation. These 5 informants, all long-term residents of the area, however, do not share a common narrative about the volcano, and their personal storylines are embedded in master narratives that reflect the social values and standards of the group or profession to which they belong. Together, their stories about the volcano show how understanding risk, in the words of Mary Douglas and Aaron Wildowski, is, quote, a matter of judgment, end quote, and that perceptions vary according to people's institutional outlook, norms, and values. How these stories are told, what is said in these stories, and the context within which these stories are produced can be said to constitute institutional and effective narratives that are important for us to better understand how people remember the past, to perceive risk in the present, and what is required, therefore, to improve contemporary disaster risk management, what I referred to right at the beginning of my talk as an applied history approach. Okay, so excuse me. Let's get on and talk about the various people and their stories. And the first story I want to talk about is the volcanologist's story. And the volcanologist's story is one about fire and rock, about ash and air, earth and water, about landscape creation and destruction as a dynamic process. To him, Mayon is not simply a volcano that he lives beside, but is also the object of his professional life and intellectual curiosity. Central to his concerns is a focus on why the volcano erupts in the manner that it does and why that's important to know. To him, an eruption is primarily a physical process, a combination of explosive phases and lava flows, of lahars, those deadly sediment-laden cement-like slurries that are caused by passing typhoons. There are people in this restless and evolving landscape, but they're never central to his plot, and they and their labors are rather ephemeral, dependent on the volcano and its workings that can both sweep away settlements, but also as well as deposit rich volcanic soils or andisols that prove so fertile and conducive to agriculture. According to how he sees it, Mayon, being a place prone to disasters and, quote, a nice place to live because of its soils, end quote, instills a deep sense of religious belief, where, quote, people turn to their faith, to God, to their God, as much as they do to their own self-sufficiency. They'll take some precautions on their own, but they will leave a lot up to God, end quote. So to the volcanologist then, risk is simply a natural consequence of people taking insufficient measures to mitigate the constant dangers posed by the volcano. Let me see if I can move myself out of the way. There we go. According to the engineer, however, Mayon, when it's considered at all, is purely a structural problem. An employee of the Department of Public Works and Highways, his concern is with maintaining and expanding the local infrastructure, particularly the road network. And the most striking aspect of the engineer's story is in fact how little the volcano features in his narrative at all. Asked whether for planning purposes, roads around the volcano were considered potential channels for lahars and located accordingly, he replied that this was never the case. When he does consider the volcano, he perceives it as a threat to his sense of progress. Lahars choke riverbeds and cause extensive damage to infrastructure, such as the destruction of the southern rail link to Legazpi City in 1993. And as such, he represents a view of nature that sees Mayon as a technical problem that demands hard engineering solutions like Savo dams that you can see in the picture here, the remains of one, that often require external funding. And of course, in the Philippines, where there is funding, there's also politics. There's no central plan as to how engineering works on non-major rivers should be funded, and politicians request money from for specific schemes from the local infrastructure project fund. Sometimes the work that is carried out from this fund is useful, but at other times it is, open quote, a politically motivated project, end quote, with no extensive prior study undertaken. A good example of this that he pointed out was the construction of the multi-billion peso Mayon circumferential road, parts of which lie within the 6-kilometer permanent danger zone where it shouldn't be, that everyone has subsequently denied authorizing. For the engineer then, the narrative he tells is one of progress, albeit often marred by politics, and the risk the volcano poses is to infrastructure that can only be mitigated through hard engineering solutions. In the third narrative, that of the politician, Mayon has become, as one might expect, an electoral issue, one of both public concern and private interest. An aide to a former governor, he was able to witness close up how politics and the volcano interact, as much depends on the timely way those elected to public office prepare communities for eruption, respond to one in progress, and mitigate the effects of future ones. Politicians, however, need to remain in office to do good and therefore depend on people's votes. Emergency situations might be moments of peril and crisis, but they are also opportunities and chances to grandstand and electioneer. Gratitude for relief distributed in times of distress begets obligations that can buy many votes during elections. And politicking takes on a new meaning in the Philippines, where the emphasis on patronage, regionalism, and lack of a strong central government intensifies partisan and factional infighting when dealing with disasters. But the volcano can be a two-edged narrative. Just as politicians win over electorates through their ability to distribute favors and largesse when people are at their most vulnerable, volcanoes just as easily prove controversial matters that can alienate voters more than attract them. Resettlement is a thorny issue, and government attempts at resettling people outside of the volcano's immediate danger zone have proven at best only partially successful. And putting people out of their homes causes resentment, even if people understood the reasons why they are being moved. Even more troubling is the question of the rapid urbanization of Legazpi City. Efforts to block licenses for poorly planned building projects or attempts to demolish unplanned houses can be very, very electorally unpalatable to politicians. And land developers are also very large potential campaign contributors for oneself or for one's political rivals. In the legislator and office holder story, then, risk has little to do with the volcano or the physical threat of eruptions and has become, above all things, a matter of politics. For the historian, the volcano is all about people and their pasts, where they lived, what they did, what they thought. A long-term resident of Camalig, who has published several books on local history, he sums up the volcano's enduring impact by concluding that most people, open quote, have learned how to live with disasters, end quote. To him, Mayon is a long-term catalyst of change in the local environment, determining the course of events by its frequent eruptions, as well as shaping people's beliefs through its brooding menace. He explains how the periodic relocation of many local towns and village sites has been heavily influenced in the past by eruptions and the paths of lava and pyroclastic density currents. For instance, residents of his own hometown of Camalig after the 1814 eruption have moved on numerous occasions, but each site proving unsatisfactory because of the location being too far from existing fields, or because people, quote, were still apprehensive that another 1814 kind of disaster might occur, close quote. And in fact, many of the towns and villages surrounding Mayon have and share similar narratives. And I'm thinking here of Guinobatan, and then the most iconic, of course, that people mainly know, as you can see from the slide here, is Cagsawa. The historian also attributes the distinct dialects or languages spoken around Mayon to topographical features created by the volcano. As its height and radial pattern, in which rainwater runs off the mountain, divides the landscape into discrete, especially in the past, cultural micro-regions. And that this, in the past, encouraged divergence in linguistic use and the creation of separate languages. And he gave as an example the three dialects or languages that compose inland Bicol. The volcano also shaped how people think and their religious practices. And he mentioned the practice of perdon, when residents stage nightly processions around their villages as a measure to ward off evil spirits and the threat of future eruptions. In the historian's story then about the volcano, the human dimension receives increasing importance, and Mayon figures as an actor of major historical significance, shaping the past record of local communities who have tried to learn to normalize the risks of their environment over time through exhibiting a willingness to adapt to the frequent eruptions and relocate when necessary. And finally, to my last narrative for today. In this last narrative, the volcano is not obviously filtered through an institutional lens, whether scientific, technical, administrative, or academic, but is experienced in the raw, unadulterated by professional culture. This last interviewee is a local resident of one of the surrounding villages and a long-term denizen of the area in her 80s. As the only woman among the 5 selected interviewees, her story also raises gender as a defining perspective on volcanoes. And it's very noticeable how women and children, almost entirely absent in other interviews, figure much more prominently. Personal terms, things she did or was told about over many decades, or things that she felt or detected through her senses. Her stories do not extend much beyond the boundaries of her immediate family history that begins and ends with her grandparents. She vividly remembers jumping out of a classroom window when she was very small and running home in the 1938 eruption when still at elementary school. Or in the 1947 eruption when she was by then at high school, but, quote, wasn't afraid anymore about that, end quote, and had stood in the school oval to watch the volcano erupt. But interestingly, her most graphic accounts are of the 1897 eruption, told to her as a child by her grandmother. How fleeing women balancing household possessions on their heads with their hands were unable to keep their sayas or dresses from blowing upwards in the strong winds from the volcano, commenting, quote, that at that time women didn't wear panties, end quote. Or more graphically, how a group of women, overcome by heat and fumes while drying their hair out of the window, were discovered dead, lying, quote, as if they were still alive, end quote. Many stories are about what happened to family members or personal recollections of eruptions, often unspecified events, as if the process was still ongoing in her mind. Although not a master narrative in the same way as with the other account, however, is not without its institutional lens, as Mayon serves a higher purpose as an instrument of divine will, as God's punishment for the sins of peoples and the ills of society. She remembers being awakened before dawn to sing, quote, a song addressed to God to forgive us of our sins, end quote, or marching barefoot in dawn processions about the village, begging for divine forgiveness, end quote. In this final narrative of risk around the volcano, understood, quote, not so much in terms of purely natural phenomena, but religion provides a form of institutional filter whereby natural hazards are interpreted as the result of human error and risk is reduced to a question of sin. Engineering problem, political issue, historical catalyst, or divine chastisement. Mayon is many risks to many people. The volcano's manifestations are as varied as the people who tell stories about it. All these narratives are infused with power relations and yet fall far short of describing what a volcano truly is or the risk it really poses. Some attempt a direct authorial voice and invest their narratives of risk in scientific or technical terms. Others seek a humanistic approach that incorporates volcanic risk into historical perspectives as catalysts of societal change. Still others see the risk of the volcano in terms of political fallout that wrong decisions or unintended omissions might have. And even stories that apparently are free from professional frameworks are constrained by an institutional lens that defines risk through evoking the divine. Together, these 5 stories present Mayon as a site of contending embodied practices, whether scientific, technical, political, historical, or spiritual. The elderly female resident feels the volcano in every sense, sight, smell, hearing, even implicitly touch, but experiences an eruption through her own actions, and particularly that of her great-grandmother. The historian explores spaces in between through his etymological discussion of place names that so vividly recall the lived experience and emotions of people in the past. Engineer and politician are all about how Mayon shapes how they think through what they do. The volcanologist tries to understand how the volcano works, the engineer to circumvent what it does, and the politician to benefit from its consequences. Yet government agencies persist in thinking of volcanic hazard as a single entity in a unified classificatory system of assessing risk. And there is no attempt at quantifying the frequency with which volcanoes erupt, a crucial factor in determining how people might feel and behave in volcanic zones. Risk perception is not based on any actual calibration of probabilistic risk, but on a measure of the factors of how people envisage it in terms of their attitudes, cognition, vulnerability, and institutional affiliation, and how they experience it through their professional, emotional, and affective states. And as historians, we're uniquely placed to tap this living archive to unravel the stories about Mayon and other sources of disruption like COVID, because we're specialists in reclaiming the past and how people interpret it, and we're used to dealing with the crises and disruptions of all kinds that punctuate people's lives. Moreover, these stories about Mayon reveal to us different concepts of how time and the past are measured. To the geologist, the past is measured in millennia and even epochs. To the engineer, the past is measured in the life of structures. To the politician, the past is measured in electoral cycles. To the historian, the past is measured in archival records. And to the local resident, the past is measured in family stories or histories. All these histories about Mayon have validity and worth and remind us of the need to explore how people feel and experience risk, to design more effective localized disaster risk management policies, and to apply the past to help the present. Only by really talking about volcanoes, of listening to the stories people tell about them, both past and present, can emergency management policy and practice be made more effectual. Thank you.